Hello, my name is Dr. Nick Bowman. I'm an associate professor of communication studies at West Virginia University. I'm going to talk to you a bit about Chapter 5 from the textbook, An Introduction to CMC, a Functional Approach. We're going to talk about the notion of news and kind of how we think about news in terms of how we get it, what it is, how we get it online, and how it satisfies that need for information. So as we start this chapter, there's a couple of things I want students to consider. First, what are the criteria for what we call newsworthiness? Another thing is how might new media technologies change the criteria we emphasize the most? What is citizen journalism and what does it say about the democratic process? What is the inverted pyramid approach and is it the same in electronic news? And what are some of the central theories associated with how we use and process news? And so the chapter 5 is really going to focus on that information goal that we talked about in the first chapters of our book. So when we talk about the media, one of the things I want to do is step back a little bit and focus on how folks have commonly discussed the role of the media in society. And the man you see on screen here is a man named Laswell. And he had argued that the role of the media should be to do three main things. The first is to survey the environment. What it meant by survey the environment was to tell people what's going on in the world. So you get up in the morning, you watch the news, you read the newspaper, and the idea behind doing that is to find out about your environment, your surroundings, and get facts and figures about the day. The watchdog, so to speak. The second one was correlation. And the idea behind correlation is that the media does a really good job of not only telling you what's happening in the world, but also perhaps telling you how you should feel about it or how society's reacting to it. So you might see a situation where there are protests happening in a town square. And the idea behind covering that type of story is you're getting a sense of how society might be responding to a particular event, a particular law, or some type of other situation. The third one's transmission. And the idea behind transmission is that one of the media's roles in society is to sort of transmit our cultural heritage. So the idea behind this argument is that we learn a lot about our environment, our culture, our values, the things we stand for, through our media products. And so for Laswell, he thought that media was a relatively simple thing. And he wrote this in the 1940s, and he said that media should tell us what's going on, surveillance. It should tell us how we feel about it, correlation. And it should tell us who we are as a culture, as a people, transmission. Now, of course, if you look at this chart, I think you're going to notice there's something missing from here. So Laswell was what's called normative scholar. And by being a normative scholar, what I mean by that is he was really telling us how things should be rather than how things perhaps really are. And what I mean by this is that there's one function of media that's surprisingly absent from this list. And I'd be curious to see if you can find it in the eCampus discussion boards. And if you can't, we'll talk about it a little later. So I want you to think hard and tell me, are there more things that you do with the media besides surveillance, correlation, and transmission? So then what is news? News is certainly more than anything happening right now. And in fact, I might give you 5 different criteria with which to understand what makes something newsworthy versus not newsworthy. And they're relatively simple. One is timing. When did something happen? One is prominence. Who is it happening to? One is proximity. Where is it happening? Both physically, being is it happening near you or far away from you? And semantically, is it a situation that's happening sort of near something you care about or about an issue that particularly concerns you? Consequence, how is it affecting us? And human interest, why should we be interested in the situation? Now, what you have on screen are a number of different images. And what I'd like you to do is go to eCampus and discuss these and kind of tell me where they might fit into the different criteria I just gave you. To walk you through them quickly, first, let's go ahead and imagine for a moment that it's 2013. It's September 2013. Here in the top left corner, we have a shooting at a mall in Nairobi, Kenya at the Westgate shopping complex. Let's assume for a minute this happened this morning. And we're getting live footage from terrorists that have taken over a mall. They've kidnapped the shoppers. They're shooting police. And they're making a political statement by taking over this mall. Down below, let's assume for a moment that there's a story happening in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Let's say that we all live in Morgantown, so Pittsburgh's only a couple minutes away. And there's a situation in which the city of Pittsburgh is going to completely overhaul its traffic and bridge patterns to hopefully make traveling through Pittsburgh a bit easier. Let's also assume for a moment that Michigan State University has announced a 50% tuition increase for its online courses. Let's assume that Prince William and Kate Middleton have gotten married, and we've got these two prominent royal figures happening in front of us, and then we're going to watch their wedding. Over here, we got Bart Simpson interviewing people in town, getting their stories, telling us about the cat lady's tragic addiction to animals, and comic book man trying to lose weight, and all of these different characters in Springfield, and sort of the daily trials and tribulations that they go through. Down below, we have the tsunamis from Japan and their impact on the people of Japan and really in the world as the damage spread throughout the region. And then we have a situation where we have traffic cameras going up in town, where as you drive through different intersections, you start seeing these cameras pop up to where the police can take a photo of your license plate, and if you were speeding, can mail you a ticket later. Well, if I were to categorize these photos, and I'd like you to go on eCampus and maybe agree or disagree with me, I might talk about the Nairobi, Kenya shooting as being very timely. I remember, assuming that we're actually back in 2013, right? I watched this story live on CNN where they were showing people running out of the mall and taking photographs, and it was quite tragic, and it was newsworthy in many ways simply because it was happening. Going down below, the city of Pittsburgh, those are things that are physically proximal to somebody who lives in Morgantown. If the city of Pittsburgh changes their traffic, that's actually going to impact how people drive even as far away as Morgantown, especially those of us who commute back and forth. The Michigan State University story, that might be very semantically proximal, because while none of us in this course, I don't believe, are currently living in the state of Michigan or attending Michigan State University, they're a public university with online courses, and if they raise their tuition, West Virginia might raise its tuition too. We've got the royal wedding, which is a very prominent event. It's involving the prince and the now princess of England, and these are people that people know quite well. And the simple fact that the individuals involved in the wedding are so prominent might be enough to trigger this as a news event. And the example I often give is that when I got married, there wasn't anybody from the media at my wedding, right? For Bart's people, we have human interest. We have journalists who go out, talk to people on the street, get their personal story. And the idea behind this is we're getting stories about the way in which perhaps people can inspire us in certain ways. It's very much our cultural heritage. The two down below, we've got the Japanese tsunamis, and we have the traffic cameras. And while it might be really strange to equate these, they're both examples of consequences, whether it's death and human tragedy, or it might simply just be a notion of getting a speeding ticket. So one of the things I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to go on to the daonline.com, which is West Virginia University student newspaper. The screenshot in front of you is quite old. It's from 2001. But I'd like you to do is go to the student newspaper now. Look through the headlines that cycle through the front page. And on eCampus, send me a link to the headlines that you think most represent one or more of the different types of newsworthiness. I want to get a sense for how you're able to understand and kind of pick up on timeliness, consequence, prominence, human interest, and then semantic and physical proximity. And walk me through why you think those stories made the newspaper. And maybe even talk a little bit in terms of which ones seem to get more attention, which ones take up more part of the paper, and what do you think that says about today's coverage of the events? And whenever you include these stories on eCampus, make sure to also link the original story or website you're referencing. You can use your own paper, of course. I just encourage you to use the student newspaper to kind of find out a bit about what's happening on our campus. One of the things I want to think about here is that the notion of news is by no means new. In fact, we've had news in society for a very long time. This ancient scroll you see on screen comes from China. They were called the Qibao. And these were ancient scrolls that were often given to government and social elite to kind of explain what was happening in the kingdoms and the emperor's domains during particular points in time. we want to keep people in touch. It's very hard to govern. It's very hard to legislate or dictate or rule when folks don't know what's happening around them. And so we've had evidence of newspapers going back thousands of years. Now, the Tapao were really only given to the social elite, people who essentially had an interest in investment in the news. If you were a very poor person, the trials and tribulations of the kingdom really didn't bother you. In fact, there's a really great line from the book Game of Thrones, and essentially what they talk about is this notion that the every person doesn't really care about the Game of Thrones that the houses play, and they fight for who's going to be king. I mean, what they really care for is happiness, good weather, and good crops, right? And as long as their environment is healthy around them immediately, who's in charge doesn't matter very much. And of course, we're going to see that mentality change when you enter into a democratic or republic society. The role of media changes quite a bit. But suffice it to say, in this situation, we have early evidence of newspapers. You may notice that a lot of papers are called Gazette, and where that actually comes from is in Italy. In olden times, there was a thing called a Gazzetta, and it was for one coin, one Gazzetta, you could buy a short tablet newspaper that kind of told you the news of the day. And your chapter 5 goes into much greater detail into the history of some of these artifacts, but humans and people have craved news for a very, very long time. It's not something that's an invention of the 20th century or the 21st century. One of the earliest ways that people receive news is through the post office. And so, in Germany, for example, the postmasters used to be the ones that delivered the news. And the idea behind this is that the post is something that's structured by the government. It's delivered every day. And you'd be surprised how well your local post handler, your mailman or mailwoman knows your area. So this map here is actually a map from outside of Michigan. This is a postal map. And if you notice, they don't even have the addresses written down. Instead, they have the people's names written down. And so these old postal workers actually knew the names of every single person in that area that they were delivering mail to. I've always thought that was pretty remarkable to think about, these folks, because they're out there every day, know what's going on. And so if you go back to, for example, Germany, which has one of the oldest postal networks in the world, they would tell the postal workers to gather stories because they're out there during the day. They'd say, well, why don't you go ahead and gather the news? And if you hear of any interesting things happening, write it down and tell us about it. And we'll publish it. And so these postmasters, they would deliver the mail, but they'd also collect stories. They collect stories, they collect rumors, they collect events and situations happening around them, maybe on their postal routes, and they bring it back to a central office. In fact, this might be why many newspapers have words like dispatch or post gazette, in some cases, because they had a heavy influence, or they were heavily influenced by the post office, which many people actually refer to the post office and the mail network as possibly the oldest social network. And if you want to go back even further, even in ancient Rome, there were postal trails and postal networks. So this ability to connect people with information not only allowed folks to get information, but it also allowed them to send information. And in many ways, you can kind of think about the U.S. Postal Service as one of the earliest versions of Facebook. Now, the growth of the common person, the growth of people, led to information being crafted for the people. And what I'm suggesting here is we can look at the history of news in the United States, and we can see a correlation between the changing patterns of society in terms of who has political power, who has voting power, and how that might have actually altered the way in which we cover the news. And so these images on screen, on the far left here, you see sort of the rise of the U.S. working class in the early 1820s, leading up through Andrew Jackson's presidency from 1829 to 1837. What you saw in the United States was a very big what's called populist movement, and it was a movement to sort of for politicians to kind of speak to the every person, the everyman, rather than only speaking to the political and economic elite. Thinking back to those Chinese newspapers, they were structured for the very high parts of society. Well, that's quite important for the study of media and newspapers, Because once we see people voting, and for example, Andrew Jackson, while his presidency is relatively controversial by most historical standards, one of the things he ushered in was this notion of Jacksonian democracy. And he essentially spoke to the everyman. And he spoke to them in their language on their issues, talked about, keeping the farm healthy, keeping their kids in school, keeping people educated. He was very much more speaking out to what he saw as a large mass of workers who were not really being listened to. Well, this notion of Jacksonian democracy, which is covered in more detail in the textbook, also opened up people's eyes to what are the issues of the day. What should, for example, the newspapers be covering? Well, in the democracy where votes are cast by the every person, and you have a Jacksonian type political system where politicians are now speaking to the everyman, you start seeing newspapers shift in terms of what they cover. And so whereas the early papers in the early history of the United States were more focused on economic and social issues that largely dealt with the upper classes of society, now you saw what was called the penny press. These were newspapers that were targeted at everybody. They would cover factory workers and weddings and stories that really impacted lots and lots of people in a very broad way. They would essentially write news to appeal to the common man. They'd charge a penny for it because charging a penny for it meant that they could afford it. And what you'll see here in a moment is essentially the birth of advertising, because it was a way to get lots of people's attention onto these broadsheets that this little boy is holding. And what we think here is that as we saw political power in a democracy such as ours, in a republic representative government such as the United States, start to grow and start to broaden to these larger swaths of society, there was a response by the newspapers to begin talking to those people. Because, economically, they're the ones that are going to buy the newspaper, and they're also the ones that are going to buy the products advertised in the newspaper. And so philosophically, when you're casting votes, you have to know what you're talking about. And so the idea is these newspapers had a bit of a responsibility to educate the common man so that they could make informed votes and informed decisions. Democracy and objectivity are kind of an interesting thing because larger audience were much more difficult to define. As the audience for the newspaper got bigger and bigger and bigger, it was increasingly difficult to define what they specifically want. If you're writing a magazine for the political elite in New York City, you could talk about Manhattan, you could talk about England, you can talk about stocks, you can talk about trade, and you know who's reading your newspaper. If you're writing a newspaper for the entire city of New York, that becomes difficult because suddenly now you've got millions of people from different ethnic backgrounds, different social backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, and they don't share a whole lot in common. And so the newspapers started writing stories that were a little bit more objective, and they were just kind of designed to, as Laswell would say, inform us as to what's happening in the world around us, and perhaps telling us how we should be responding to those events. What we essentially saw was the penny press, as I said earlier. It was printed every day. It was sold for a penny. It covered a wide range of topics. And if you want a good example of this, the New York Times. The New York Times, one of the probably stalwart publications in the field of print journalism and even online journalism, started as a penny press. It was a way to get lots of news to lots of people in a very cheap way, with the bills being funded by advertisers. And the idea there was that advertisers craved these larger audience even more than the newspaper did, because this meant that if everybody's reading the news, because everyone wants to know what's going on, and for the first time in sort of our political and social history, we're listening to the common person and we're putting a paper in their hands. It makes sense if you're a Coca-Cola or a Ford or a large corporation that's selling products to go ahead and buy some space in that newspaper and tell folks about your product that day. It fundamentally changed the economic structure of the news. And we'll talk about this a little more when we talk about advertising and persuasion later on in the semester. The idea of news has changed quite a bit with technology, right? So if you go back, to the Pony Express days, me being a native Missourian, you learn lots about the Pony Express. And the idea is you can get a letter from the Pony Express stables outside St. Joseph's, Missouri, all the way out to San Francisco, California. And the Pony Express riders could make that trip in about 10 days, which was considered unbelievable in the 1800s. To be able to deliver a letter from Missouri to California in about a week's time was just crazy. Um, the point I'm making here is that information has always been incredibly limited because physical analog information, things you got to hold, can only travel as fast as the dominant form of transportation at the time. So in the 1800s, it could travel by horse. Today, I can mail a letter. I can mail a letter from Germany to the United States. It'll be on an airplane for a couple hours. That's going to get into a truck. And the truck's going to drive to a post office. Then they're going to give it to your delivery person, and that person's going to walk it to your house. It can only go so fast. It's limited by its physical medium, right? We can only carry physical objects as fast as whatever the quickest mode of transportation is at that time in society, right? The marathon runners would just run naked on foot and run a letter from battlefield to battlefield. Well, of course, today we don't have this. Today we have digital networks, as we talked about in the earlier chapters, where messages can be translated into ones and zeros, transmitted through these global internet lines. And if you want more information about this, you can click on this image in the PowerPoint slides. You can actually see the global internet map, and that is how the different continents are physically connected to one another. It's a remarkable thing to see, and we sometimes forget that the internet's still very much a physical thing. Well, we can send a note now from Germany to the United States, essentially the time it takes you to send an electronic signal through a wire. And so, in many ways, like when you're using, an email service, for example, it might be a matter of seconds. And you can imagine how rapidly that has sped up our ability to process, understand, and read information. Thinking back to earlier in this discussion about that notion of proximity, many folks might matter that physical proximity is becoming less and less important because the world, quite frankly, has become smaller. Now imagine that Pony Express line here. You see these two radio towers pop up. That 10 days can now be covered in probably 10 milliseconds. Looking at all these cultural and structural and technological changes to the news, we actually saw differences in the structural way a news story had been written. We see more and more stories meant for more and more people with more and more variety of backgrounds and education and readability and interest. And what we start to see in the news industry is a development towards the inverted pyramid style of journalism, which kind of coincided with the penny press. Some of you may be familiar with this. You write a story, and the first paragraph, that first 30 words, has the lead. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. This is kind of where you sell those different newsworthiness items, consequence, prominence, timing, etc. And that's the most important part of the story. And the idea behind this was that news readers need to get the basic information first. And then if they want more information, they can read the body, which clarifies the critical bits. They can go down to the tall, which is the background information, the drama behind the story. But the important parts are bolded here in red. It's that super quick first paragraph. Part of this was economic. When you're writing news for lots of people, it's got to be easy to read. It's got to be quick to read. There are some, and you don't want to bias your stories because you're writing them for everybody. So it's not as if you can write a story with a particular political or social bend to it because you're trying to get as many people as possible to read the newspaper. At least that was the philosophy. There's also stories that this was also written for a very technological reason, that sometimes the early telegraph lines would break. And so when a journalist sent in their story, the idea was that if the story got broken halfway through the telegraph or halfway through the telegram, that at least the lead would make it through. And we're not sure how accurate that story is. It's kind of a funny one to think about. If you ever called your parents and you're running out of minutes on your cell phone, and so you quickly tell them the most important thing, and then you hang up before you lose the call, right? But the idea is that you see the inverted pyramid even still today. In fact, I want you on eCampus, if you go through your town newspaper or your university newspaper or any type of newspaper article, I'd like you to compare the different types of inverted pyramid stories written there to maybe a magazine or a website where they might go into more detail about a particular event. So I'd be curious what you guys find in terms of inverted pyramid style writing. The oldest newspapers actually go back to 1645. This is kind of an interesting little cultural point. The Swedish poet Enriques Tinninjar. I always say it incorrectly, so forgive me for those Swedish speakers in the audience here. It's the oldest paper in the world, started in 1645 and has published every day since then. Although in 2007, they went online and the editor-in-chief thought it was this cultural disaster. I respectfully disagree. I think that it's nice to be romantic about the news and about the newspaper. And in fact, if you click on this image here, you'll take you to the website of the POIT. But at the same time, the news is news and things continue. In 1645, printing was a brand new technology. And I'm sure the people of the day thought it was kind of an atrocity to print stories every day instead of just telling them face to face. And, now we have an online system where, ironically enough, you and I can read more about Sweden if you felt like. As I've already kind of said, as news became more valuable, it became enhanced through technology. So we had, the penny press and the inverted pyramid. But we had some really cool things, particularly at KDKA in Pittsburgh. The first radio broadcast in 1919. They broadcast live the 1920 U.S. presidential election, which that was a pretty cool event where for the first times in history, Americans following politics knew who the president was that day or as soon as the results were made known. They broadcast in early 1921 a Major League Baseball game. You could probably guess the opponents, the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Philadelphia Phillies. And in these firsts, audiences were able to follow events without actually attending them for the first time. That's pretty important. When we think about communication technology and some of the things that we use it for, the ability to learn about our world through secondary experiences is incredibly powerful for us understanding the way things work around us. And while here we're talking about elections and baseball games, they can be very serious and very trivial things. But the point is, we know what's going on. We're using our technology to know what's happening in the world around us. Not all technology is designed to be broadcast, of course. In fact, we're seeing more and more things that are very unique to tailored information, exclusive distribution, cable signals, email addresses, very specific websites. And one of the things that we're seeing here is that we go back to our early chapters about message access exclusivity. Now, when we have broadcast radio, broadcast television, these things that use the electromagnetic spectrum, that available area of wavelength, so where we can actually send a signal to people in the audience, those are meant for everybody. And as a result, they're heavily regulated. The content's regulated. You can't say certain words. You can't swear. You can't show nudity. You don't want to use smoking. A lot of social ills aren't allowed on broadcast television. Well, that changes quite a bit when we start going to things like cable, where the news consumer or the information consumer is voluntarily plugging their TV physically into a network of content. And we'll talk about that here. In fact, we can understand the role of regulation of media if we understand different types of media, broadcast versus narrowcast versus tailored. Broadcast is intended for everybody. Narrowcast are often media products that are customized towards very specific audiences. And tailored content is often stuff that is, like a fine suit or clothing is tailored for the individual consuming the content. Now, I'd like you in your own time to watch this Family Guy clip, and it's a bit racy, but it's not inappropriate. Because they talk a lot about Peter Griffin starting this program called PTV. And he gets in trouble for showing some sexual content and some content using alcohol. And one of the things I want you to do is watch Peter Griffin's FCC video, his song. You can click on the link there. It'll take you right to the song. You can also find it online and on eCampus. And I want you to tell me that of broadcast, narrowcast, or tailored content, which one does the FCC tend to regulate the most? And then tell me the reasons behind that regulation. Share those with me on eCampus, and you can also read more about Griffin's song here in your textbook. Now, as we shift towards the end of our chapter, there's a great quote by American author and journalist Lev Grossman. And he says, it's all about the many wresting power from the few, and how that not only changes the world, but also changes the way the world changes. Now, what Lev Grossman was talking about when he said it's, in many ways, he's referring to this notion of the source of media changing, and that how in today's society, you no longer have to rely on the mass media sources, CNN, Time Magazine, the newspaper, television station, to tell stories. In fact, today's media comes from all of us. Here's a list of very famous Twitter accounts, and if you recognize any of these names, you've got the musician and sort of pop culture icon Questlove. You've got just different average people on here. The one at the bottom, really virtual. He's the guy who live blogged the death of Osama bin Laden. He was looking out of his window in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and he saw the U.S. Marine Corps invade Obama's complex and shoot him. You had High Force, who was the Twitter user who actually watched Sully Sullenberger land an airplane in the Hudson River in Manhattan. You've got other individuals on this list who just shared information about the gunman shooting up the Discovery Channel headquarters. And what I'm getting at here, Questlove was talking about the Occupy Wall Street movements, and he was warning rioters to hey, there's lots of cops in riot gear pulling up next to my house. You guys need to be careful out there. None of these people are journalists. None of these people intended to be journalists. They were simply telling stories about the world around them. They're examples of what's called the citizen journalist. These are the people who simply use their technology to tell stories about their environment to the rest of us. And while some of us use cat videos and pictures of our children graduating kindergarten, some of us talk about gunmen and shootings and riots and human tragedy and human triumph. Citizen journalists are amateur journalists. They're not often trained in sort of the rules and regulation and ethics of being a reporter. And perhaps what makes them differ from a professional journalist is that the citizen journalist often doesn't have the ethical code of the Society of Professional Journalists. The economic structures are very different. Citizen journalists are often not paid for their reporting or paid for their stories, where of course, I'm a former journalist, I got paid a salary to tell stories. And there's also an epistemological difference in terms of how they see knowledge in the world, where a good professional journalist is supposed to be sort of a fact finder and a truth sayer, whereas a citizen journalist, their goal really is more to not necessarily share their opinion, but certainly share bits of information that often come with a rather heavy bias associated with them. One of the common critiques of the citizen journalist is they only tell stories that interest, of their particular political mindset or agenda. And that's not necessarily even a bad thing, but it points to perhaps a difference between getting the news from a Twitter account versus getting the news from an amateur Twitter account versus getting the news from a professional newspaper. And there's lots of debates between these two, including whether or not these distinctions are even relevant. And one of the ways I always explain it is imagine watching NASCAR, watching professional race car drivers, and compare that to your daily commute around town. And oftentimes, so I'm a racing fan, and my friends make fun of me because they're like, well, what do those guys do in those cars that I don't do when I drive every day? And, they go, well, I make left turns and stop in traffic and avoid hitting people when I race people on the interstate, so why can't I race a car? And I often tell them to hop behind the wheel of an 800-pound stock car, 800 horsepower stock car, and you notice some pretty big differences. So it's one of these things that on the surface, it's just driving, it's just racing. But the difference between driving a stock car and driving, your car to work and back are much more subtle. For example, in the racing scenario, these drivers drive 500 miles at an average speed of 130 to 150 miles an hour. You put 43 cars on a track that's maybe a half mile around. There's no mirrors, there's no lights. Bumping is encouraged. You get behind a car and you tailgate people, not because you're mad for cutting you off, but because they make your car go faster. And in fact, I'd like you guys, to go on campus and tell me, what is the difference between being a citizen reporter and being a professional reporter? Or what is the difference between driving a race car and driving a passenger car? And the point I'm getting at here is this is a debate that's not been well solved, because as I showed you on the previous slide, citizen journalists have actually broken some of the most important stories of the 21st century. At the same time, they're often not trying to be journalists. They're just trying to tell stories, because at the end of the day, some might argue, like those early postmasters, that perhaps news is just people telling stories. Should there be a big structural, ethical, and economical structure to the news? Or should it just be people telling people what they saw? And I'd like you guys to go on eCampus and debate whether or not you think the citizen journalist and the professional journalist really differ all that much. What you might even do is try to find examples in the news from, what you might see as like a citizen blog versus like the New York Times and compare how they discuss a particular story. I think as a hint, one of the things you'll find is the relative levels of bias between like a CNN or a Fox News article and an article written by a citizen journalist. And I'd be curious to hear what you think about this debate. A couple quick theories of news. You can read more about these in your book. One of them is what's called the agenda setting effect. You see it on screen. And the idea is the press may not be successful much of the time in telling us what to think, but it's stunningly successful in telling us what to think about. And the notion here is that oftentimes media reports about events do not necessarily bias us to think about whether something was good or bad. But the sheer fact that some events in society get a lot more coverage than others kind of tells us what we think is more important or less important. A great example of this might be the recent efforts in the United States to extend marriage rights to homosexual couples. One argument you could put forward is that these were issues that, throughout most of the 20th century, it's not as if there weren't homosexuals in the United States, but we just didn't cover homosexual issues very often in newspapers. LGBT rights wasn't really something we talked about. And then over the last couple of years, you see more and more coverage of LGBT rights. And that coverage accumulates in sort of the public thinking more about extending civil rights to homosexuals in a way that we perhaps didn't think before. And so you can see an example of the agenda setting effect by which the media typically, covers this, the tragedy of civil rights. And they cover this notion of a particular population of Americans, that is LGBT, not getting equal protections under the law. And as those stories continually find their way into the media agenda, the public starts to think more about those stories. And again, this isn't necessarily telling you to think whether or not you agree or disagree with the notion of extending gay rights as civil rights. The idea is that's now a discussion item that wasn't there before, which eventually influences the way people vote. And so, in fact, on eCampus, I might challenge you to try to find some agenda items in today's newspaper and see how you think they're influencing public agendas and then influencing policy agendas, that is, voting in politics. I also might ask you, is this still true with Web 2.0? Do we get our agendas from the newspaper? Or perhaps as we share more information, as more and more citizen journalists cover stories, we might actually see the public influencing the media agenda. It's a question that's open for interpretation and debate. We can also talk about exemplification, and that's using examples to tell a story. The idea here is that when the media covers events, we don't often just choose things at random. We choose events that represent particular issues of the day. And so here we have, a Middle East protest against the United States where somebody's burning the American flag. And we commonly use this as an example of Middle Eastern relations in the United States. And I might counter argue that there's a potential role of danger in stories like this because what they don't do is tell us, does this represent all Middle Easterners, all Arab populations, for example? Or does this only represent a very particular slice of an Arab population that doesn't like the United States? Exemplification theory talks about how we use examples to tell stories, but the critique of this method is that those stories don't always represent the larger people they represent. A common example is that whenever an Islamic extremist commits an act of terrorism, oftentimes in the United States, we associate that with all Muslims, which is probably not a very accurate way to discuss this. And so and let's say you also don't have any personal experience with anybody from a different religion, and the only images you see on TV are images of people from that religion or from that worldview burning your flag, we start to wonder if you start to bias your opinions about, in this case, Muslims or Arabs or Middle Eastern populations because you think they all want to burn the flag. And it's a debate that we're having in media research right now. What is the role of using examples to tell a story, and how might those examples actually damage or help politics? And we can talk about that online as well. Finally, I want to talk about framing theory, and it's how we select aspects of a story in order to guide interpretations of the story. And I'll give a very quick example here. We're running a bit long on the presentation, and you can read about this more in your book. Imagine you were reading a story about abortion rights, so whether or not women should have the freedom of choice to decide what happens to their bodies, or whether or not we view certain choices as being immoral. And for example, you're killing a child in some cases. And if you were to run the same story about abortion rights, and like in one condition, you were to use a story of a fetus or a picture of like this fetus in the corner. And then another condition, you were to use a blue-eyed little baby as your photo to accompany your story. I suspect what you would find is that people who read the story with the fetus picture probably wouldn't have very strong reactions. It's a more of a clinical, biological, medical framing of the story. Whereas people reading the story with the blue-eyed baby in the corner might have a much more emotional, humanistic, and life attachment to the story. And so you can see how selecting certain aspects of the story potentially have a great impact on the way in which that story might be interpreted by your readers. And we'll talk more about this as well. We see the same thing with the Trayvon Martin shooting a couple of years ago, where we had a neighborhood watchman in an altercation with an African-American teenager, and eventually he shot and killed the teenager after a fight. Well, when you run a photo of George Zimmerman, the man who was eventually found not innocent of first-degree murder, when you show a picture of him, frowning with, kind of a scruffy beard and an orange jumpsuit and earrings, he looks very, very dangerous. He looks like he might be somebody who would shoot a teenager. And then you run a photo of the same man in a suit and tie with his hair trimmed nice and his beard trimmed nice. All of a sudden, he looks like somebody who you wouldn't think would possibly shoot a young African-American child. And so again, it's an example of oftentimes news outlets will choose very particular pictures to frame a story in a particular way. This is something we should be very cognizant of, especially when we think about the debate between professional and amateur citizen journalists, how these very careful selection of facts and photos bias a story, because the important thing here is that nobody's lying. They're just choosing very carefully the details they want to convey in their story. So chapter summary, there's always been an audience for news, and technology has made that audience easier to reach and easier to define. As technologies become more participatory, it's Web 2.0, we see more information from the crowd. And today's news audience has access to and much more balance from more sources than ever before. So as always, at the end of our chapter, we'd like to invite you to go online and answer some questions using our social media accounts. Again, these are voluntary. They're not graded components of the course, but they might help us start a conversation above and beyond the conversations we have on eCampus. How many different news sources do you think you use on a daily basis? Do you get your news from social media? Have you ever used social media platforms to report something that you were an eyewitness to? We should share those answers on Twitter using Media is Tools. It's incorrectly listed as Tool. That's Media is Tools with an S. Or on the class Facebook page, and the URL for that page is listed below. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.